to the How We Do Digital Ministry podcast. On this podcast, we talk to leaders in the church who are out in the world engaging folks through digital ministry. And today I am delighted to have with me Jon Pyle. Jon is the host of the Better on the Inside podcast. He's also the associate pastor at CityChurch. He's wearing the t-shirt to prove that. And there we go. Jon, thank you for being with me. I'd love to start with, tell us about this podcast. Tell us about Better on the Inside, please.
Oh, thank you for having me, Charlotte. I really appreciate it. And I'm so thankful in a time where their bones are their money. That we bought Charlotte.
That is the currency of this month.
Charlotte and I have bonded over references to one of our favorite shows. But the Better on the Inside podcast started about a year ago. And I started recording interviews a little more than a year ago because it was originally set to be something else. And we were kind of working with our digital team. So like flashback to a year and a half ago where we were with COVID, where churches were with attendance, where we were with everything. And part of our digital strategy was like, I think we should produce a podcast. I was feeling something. We worked on it with a larger team and kind of developed something that was good, but it wasn't quite the right angle. But so we developed something that was good, and I can't even remember if we had a title for it yet. But we were recording episodes like that, and I was doing an intro and outro as that kind of podcast of like the messy middle, I think it was called, which isn't a bad name, but it just wasn't quite right. And as I got pushed by one of my producers, as it kind of got closer to really launching, Andre Jennings, a friend, and he was like, what do you really want to talk about? What do you like? And pushed and pushed and pushed. And that's where Better on the Inside came from. Because in the middle of doing ministry, especially during COVID, all this time, I looked at our staff and I looked at other people who worked at churches and volunteered at churches, and they were spent. They were running on empty. And then they were asked to minister to other people, right? They were asked to help others and pour out and serve for others, even though it was really drawing from an empty well, and I could just see it. And so that like heart of just, man, I would really love to do something that talks about the experience of people that work at the church and kind of being super just taxed and all that goes into that. And I saw a lot of people quitting the church in record numbers. I saw pastors quitting in record numbers. And so that's kind of where it came from. And it's asking the question, this is our tagline that's pretty provocative, like working for a church without losing your soul. And that's where the show came from. So that's kind of where we started with the show and what the hope was to discover. How do we do that?
Wow. What a great gift to the church. What has surprised you most working through this project?
What has surprised me most is that I'm so used to coming from a construct as a pastor of having answers versus asking questions. And sitting in a space where I get to ask questions of people, of just asking like, what's going on with you? And it's a curiosity, right? The whole name of the show, Better on the Inside, comes from the idea that how can we make churches better on the inside, right? That's kind of the central question, because we notice this progression of you're going to the church, you love it, you're fired up by it, you get more involved, and you're still like, yeah, and then you kind of become the star volunteer, which is like maybe one of the most put up on a pedestal positions of like, this is the coolest person in the world. And then once you get past that star volunteer point, as you serve more, I wasn't sure that people were actually getting closer to Jesus. It seemed like they were getting closer to burnout. It seemed like they were getting closer to all of the stuff we talked about of frustration and kind of being dry. And so there was a moment where it's like, man, the more time people serve, the more jaded and burnt out and stressed they seem to get. So what if we created a church that was better on the inside, right? That's kind of where the title came from. So all that to say, it's been asking the question, like, how do we make the church better on the inside? And I've gotten answers that I would have never, ever thought of. And I sat with people in spaces that I never would have considered. And I got perspectives that were just so invaluable. as somebody who works kind of in the mega church world, right? I got these answers that I wouldn't have expected, that have changed my perspective on how I just see how the job I do in church in general.
Mm, mm. Give us, if you will, can you share one of those answers, or maybe a repeated theme? Julie, this is the title. People, you got to put this on your radar, folks. Maybe.
Yes. And I think there's a lot of conversation about deconstruction. And so the larger kind of thing that I'm seeing. So let me do I'll cheat, and I'll get kind of two answers in here.
Great.
One of the things that I'm seeing is, I don't think we've reckoned as the church with how many people are leaving the church and never coming back.
Mm-hmm.
And, or at least not any intention to come back now. And just reading the stats of, 69% of people don't trust organized religion, according to a Gallup poll. And 10% of young people, only 10% of young people had a religious leader reach out to them during the pandemic. And so you're seeing this pull away from organized institutional church. And it's a bigger thing than I think we're talking about. I think we're having conversations about it, but we need to accept the fact that they're not coming back. If I could say one thing to every pastor in America, it would be, they're not coming back. And it's not because you're a horrible person. It's not because you've done something particular. Like, this is just the trend, and we could figure out why, but but you have to start living not as, okay, now we can get back to normal now that the pandemic is quote unquote over, which that's a whole other conversation. But we can get back to what we were doing. We're living in a whole new world. Looking back isn't going to help us. So that's one of kind of the statistic pieces. I think if I had a pithy statement, it's that people are defining church by where they get their care and not their content.
Ooh, okay.
And so content is cheap, ubiquitous. Everybody makes sermon content, and that, like, we work really hard on our sermons. Like, I get it, and I'm not cheapening that at all. What I mean by cheap is the market is flooded with it. The supply of content that people could have. And look, I'm like, I think I'm pretty good preaching. Like, I'm not bad. Like, I'm pretty good. There are literally 100 people you could download in the next 5 minutes that are better than me.
Sure.
And spend your whole week listening to that. And so I think people are defining their church not by where they go to Sunday service, or where they watch Sunday service, or what worship team they listen to, or what pastor preaches. I think they're defining their church as where they get their care. The people that reach out, the people that visit them in the hospital, that do their weddings, that do their funerals, the people that are with them through the difficult times. I think that is the shift that kind of connects the 2 points together.
Okay. All right. So a little less maybe emphasis on production value, and some just reaching out, making phone calls and texts and emails, and showing face, huh?
Yeah. Well, and so, like, part of the interesting thing about digital is that we think of care so often as something that is in person, which is true. But I think the viability of digital relationships is that digital has kind of become a tool and enabled in-person relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And so our most successful group, now I'm spinning off a little bit, but some of our most successful groups were groups that met digitally. And because digital is a valid way to connect person to person, and care doesn't necessarily have to be in person to do that. And so I think the podcast, there are weeks where it can be kind of overwhelming just in hearing the stories of people that are looking for that care.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how has this project changed you?
Oh, that's such a wonderful question. It's such a wonderful question. I've really had to look inward and think about what I think the future of church is. And the best way that I could describe it is I really feel like it's made me accountable to having a vision for the future. And here's what I mean. In digital spaces, it is really easy to critique, and any space, really. This isn't just digital spaces. It's easy to critique. It's really difficult to create. And I think it's easy right now to kind of stand on the sidelines and critique church. And I'm not saying that people who have been abused by the church are doing that. I'm not like, it's not to say that that is the wrong thing, but the burden that I felt is that I can't just be a part, just go with the status quo. I feel a real burden not to just accept the status quo, but instead to ask questions that are more vision-y kind of questions, that are going, well, what do we build if this isn't going to work, right? If the system isn't serving people well, then what's next? And I didn't feel like I could just kind of sit and roll with the status quo because things are okay. Like our church is doing okay. Like my position, I feel like is pretty safe. Like I could just kind of roll with it. And I just felt a different kind of burden. And I don't know if it's spiritual. I don't know if it's personal. Like there wasn't a God came to me and said something, but I just felt like I couldn't engage from the sidelines anymore. Like I really needed to like try to go somewhere, and try to help like lead to something. And that's part of why we wanted to, try to establish a community with the podcast, right? Because it felt the first few episodes, I'm bringing up some like pretty serious things. And so, one of the things in the first episode, we talk about becoming holy and how messy it is to become holy and all that stuff. And people are listening and having a significant experience. And at the beginning, you have a podcast, right? At the beginning, it's like friends and family that are listening, and like people that are connected with you, and people are going like, hey, like this is really significant. And I realized, oh my gosh, I'm not just putting a podcast out for people to consume. Like I really do feel responsible to connect with people and continue the conversation, that like this moved them, or this created something in them. And so this podcast has really put me in what I would say is more of an active thought around like, I can't just be on the sidelines and be like, man, yeah, I don't know that this system is working, and just kind of continue to say that. It feels like I have to be going with people to whatever's next. And so that is how some of the questions I think have changed me.
That's excellent. What made you decide to do this work as a podcast? I mean, you could do it as an interview blog or a book or, 1,000 other ways. What are the advantages here?
Great question. One, I love podcasts. I think there's something like I listen to podcasts, and I don't know that there's a podcast culture per se. It's becoming like a thing, but I was listening to podcasts. Like I've been listening to podcasts for, 15 years at this point. Like I remember listening to radio shows back when I lived in Southern California on my long drives when I worked a corporate job. And so I've always been attracted to podcasting and blogging and kind of that world. So I've always been about it. But I think there's something to the format came from something I loved. And I wanted to start a podcast. The form of it, I finally had the function for the form. I've always wanted to have a podcast. I've had other podcasts, like I've started other things and all that, but like it just, a podcast felt right. So that's the first part, is that I loved it. Like it feels right. It felt like something, the number two part is it felt like something that I could do, we could do, whether it was myself in a small team without a lot of resources. And there's editing that goes into it, but like the difference between a podcast and a YouTube show can be pretty significant, in terms of, I mean, you do video and audio with what you're doing, and there's other things that you have to think about, right? Video syncing and making sure it all looks right. And then maybe the third is that I love talking to people. And this gives me, and I love talking to strangers, actually, very specifically. And so I'm the guy in the airport, and anybody that travels with me knows I'm going to meet somebody. it tends to happen. Now that I'm a little bit older and maybe a little bit more mature, I'm a little less aggressive. And it just kind of comes and it happens if the moment works. And so I don't feel like I need it. But I love meeting new people. And so a podcast is a really good way to do that, like an interview blog, or sometimes with video stuff. With video stuff, there's challenges in getting everybody in the same room, or even digitally getting everybody in the same room. But a podcast feels like a totally legitimate way to talk to strangers and just understand, like, everybody that I've interviewed on my podcast so far, I would want to hang out with.
Yeah.
And that feels like a little bit of a value, because I've always tried to treat it like a conversation versus an interview. And because what I feel like I'm inviting the community that, and like, I don't have millions of downloads or anything, right? Like, it's a pretty small community of people that I love and appreciate, but I've wanted to invite this community in on the conversation. And I think the magic happens when we discover something together in the podcast versus being very like pre-planned and like, this is what this episode is going to be about. I'm going to say this thing. And it's like, let's discover this conversation magic to recreate that feeling. Because Charlotte, you've had those conversations with people, right? Where you're just like figuring out life or figuring out something, and you're just talking and you're like, oh my gosh, that's a moment. And that feels so cool and organic and authentic. And so I think we were trying to capture some of that, and me meeting new people that, all that stuff. So all that to say, it was a mix of resources, interest and passion, and like personal calling and gifting.
I'm so happy for you, Jon.
Yeah. Well, I tell my wife all the time, podcasting doesn't feel like work. It's like the thing that I would do if I didn't the quote that I had with some friends a little while ago was like, I've been podcasting since I was a kid. I just started recording it recently. Mm-hmm. And my friend Rob and I were joking about how we like invented the conversation of like, what if we did a podcast, but we didn't record it? And it was just me. And Rob was like, yeah, that's a conversation. Like, that's something that people have done like forever. And I'm like, oh, I just invented the conversation. But I feel like I've just started to record these things, and I get pretty excited about it.
Wow. Well, it's always a privilege to have a real innovator on the podcast.
No, Charlotte, I've invented the library.
Wow.
Like, I've reinvented, like, what if there was a place for the community where we could just exchange books and like read books that we didn't have? Like, I've reinvented so many really good ideas and had people point those things out to me. So I invented the conversation, which is that's a pretty big one to put under your belt.
I'm in awe, frankly.
Yeah.
So as we noted, the pandemic still rages around us. But there's a sense of there's something new happening. Mm-hmm. And I'm finding in my conversations with church leaders that like this time, I wish we'll have words for these later once they passed, right?
Yeah.
But this particular time seems in some ways just far more stressful than, let's say, those first months of 2020, because we knew what had to be done, let's say then, and now jumbling so much. I wonder, and it's not just this digital stuff, right? Sure. What are you hearing is just beating folks down? We'll get to the hope part. We're not going to dwell there, but I just for other folks just to have a sample to hear. Yeah. Like, where are we all right now?
Let me say this, Charlotte, and I get excited talking about suffering, which is weird. But as Christians, we want to jump to the hope too fast.
Yeah.
We want there to be hope. So I call that beginning portion of the pandemic the Tiger King portion.
Okay.
it's where we thought we're going to be locked down for 2 weeks. We'll watch Tiger King on Netflix.
I
We'll
watched
get our
The
groceries.
Circle. That was
Okay,
that was where I was.
It's the portion where we were like making jokes about it and memes of just like, we're going to lock down, and everybody was kind of in step. Like everybody felt like we were like, yeah, Tom Hanks has COVID. We're going to make sure that we don't spread it, right? There's no vaccine. Like that's the Tiger King portion. But part of what you're talking about is just this long tail of how do we even define, like you talk to some people and they're kind of like, it's over. We're good. We're just going to move on with no whatever. And then you talk to other people that are like, I'm still wearing a mask. Like I'm still worried about this stuff. And so we're in this really confusing portion of the pandemic. And so
there's also, Jon, just to interrupt, the fall of democracy, a racial
good Lord,
the potential for a world war.
Oh man, we've got all these things that have kind of bubbled to the surface, right? And golly, I'd almost forgot. We had the George Floyd thing. Like we've had all these milestones in a real what feels like a short amount of time. It feels like this has been 10 years and 10 months all at the same, like it just feels forever. I think I was listening to something from Pastor Rick Warren, and this was close to the beginning. And so I think he gets this right. And so whenever I use a pastor as an example, I'm always like, dear God, I hope he doesn't do something wrong so that this is bad. But I do think
Rick Warren just
well, I actually do know some things that maybe he's mishandled in his successor. So that's a whole other thing. But this is wisdom from Pastor Rick Warren, not to say that it's all wisdom, is that there's a tsunami of grief that is going to hit kind of after we start thinking about the physical repercussions of this. And he told stories about disaster relief of the pastor's time is after Katrina hits, after these tsunamis, these natural disasters, these earthquakes, these fires, where the cleanup teams start to leave, where you have to rebuild. And then there's a spiritual, emotional, grief that just sits with people. And it's like a big wave that's going to crash on them. Mm-hmm. And so this tsunami of grief, and I think that's the thing we're all feeling. We're feeling this loss. And if you're a kid or a high school student, you maybe didn't go to prom. Your school experience wasn't the same. If, I had a kid that was in kindergarten, digitally. Mm-hmm. And it's and we've all lost something, and millions of people have lost loved ones. And we've lost jobs. And this is a period marked by loss. And we as a society suck at grieving for the exact reason that you kind of set up the question of no, don't worry, the hope is coming. Because the grief is the part that sometimes you don't feel hope. You have to sit in it and process your grief. And I think it's something as a society and as pastors, particularly, we have largely failed at to create a robust theology of suffering that people can see themselves in. A theology where it doesn't feel like God abandoned us because we lost our parent. It doesn't feel like we're failing at life because we don't have a job and we're depressed and we're anxious. And so I think the way that we handle grief in this period, the way that we talk about grief, the way that we sit with people in their grief, Charlotte, the way that we deal with our own grief instead of just serving others. Yeah. How we handle grief during this period is what everybody's feeling. And I think if people aren't feeling that, they're lying. And I don't think anybody's through it, because the point that you've made is that there's all these things that have happened in this period, but people are still dying of COVID. People, there's still so much loss, so much grief. And then now some of the financial consequences are hitting. I was just if you've tried to buy a house, the interest rate is insane. And you can't buy a house in our area because it's being bought up by companies. And the economic impact is starting to hit people, and there's no more stimulus checks. And there's all this loss. And we as a society, especially in America, I won't speak for any of your international folks, but here in America, we're win. It's up and to the right. It's growth. It's progress. It's all of that. And the church, largely the evangelical church, the church industrial complex, as I call it, We're built to be up and to the right all the time. And if you're not, you're failing.
Mm-hmm.
So what does a church that's built to be successful and go up and to the right? What does a society that's built to move forward and innovate and make more money and have more things? What does a society like that do with grief? It goes the opposite direction of everything we've been taught and everything we've learned. So I think we're all bummed. I think we're all down. And I think we're all wrestling with this idea of grief. And there are some people that are bringing certainty to uncertainty. And I think that's the absolute wrong thing to do. If there's somebody certain, I would be so afraid to follow that person because nobody knows what's going to happen. And usually in church world, Charlotte, like you've probably been around long enough to know that somebody always has an answer. Willow Creek has an answer. Saddleback has an answer. And this isn't a diss of any of those things. Like you go to church conferences and there's kind of a way. There's kind of a general, like, this is the way that we're going. None of those people have that right now. Nobody's like, this is how ministry is going to look in 10 years, right? Like nobody has it. And so we're in this space where we're having to just sit with grief and really wrestle with the successes and also the failures of how we've been doing church. And just being like, how do my people believe in QAnon so easily?
Yeah.
Right. And conspiracy theories and all that. So I think we're having to sit with this grief, and I think it's really uncomfortable, and we want to move on and get out of it as soon as possible. But that would be the worst thing for us, because I think we can be formed in this grief to be something better, and something that as pastors I take seriously. We can be formed by our own grief and transformed by our own needs and our own emptying and our own challenges to be the kind of spiritual leaders that can help folks make sense of a world with so much loss.
I love that. Yeah, thank you. I think that's part of what I really appreciate about your project is, it's kind of theology through storytelling. Through listening and hearing, and like this moment to let's put everything on the table and just how are we going to even begin to pretend to sort it out? But let's hear and let's share, and that openness and vulnerability there, then that does create sacred spaces in which the creative could thrive. Yeah. I love that. What's fueling you right now?
Okay. I tried to think of, I'm not sure if you're an Enneagram person, but
I guess everyone is. I don't
know. But some people are into it and some people are like really skeptical of it. And so all of that to say, like, my Enneagram 2, for anybody that rolls with that kind of stuff, my first thought was what I thought. Then the next thought was, no, make it sound like something that is like helping people, that fuels you. But part of it is ambition, like just straight up. Maybe there's good ambition and maybe sometimes there's dark ambition fueling some of that. It exists within me. And so anytime I have to be, just as my personality, I have to be very aware of, am I building my kingdom or God's? And I think I would be being dishonest if there wasn't a little bit of ambition and platform building as a part of what's driving me. I'd like to think that that's a small part that I try to like wrestle with and put in the right place. But I don't want to be disingenuous and be like, well, I'm serving people. And that's the thing that it's like, I'm a regular person like you. And I check my download numbers, right? Like duh, it matters. So there's certainly a small part of it that's that. I also think what's driving me is that I've kind of become obsessed. Once you hear people's stories, and once you encounter people who are suffering and struggling, if you choose not to look away, you cannot help but act. You can choose to look away. And sometimes that's healthy. Like a shout out, just a word for all my helpers out there. You can't help everybody. You can't be super passionate about every cause. You can't pour yourself out constantly. Like, but so looking away can be okay. But once you look at something and you go, these people need help. Like, I just have the kind of personality where if I choose not to look away, I have to do something. Mm-hmm. And I'm very competitive. I was just thinking about this today. To me, the competitive thing, like the joke in my family is that I always get injured, like still playing sports like I'm 19. And I'm not, right? And I can't, my body doesn't do those things. And so I've separated my shoulder, broken fingers, the whole thing. Like, I'm competitive, but the competitiveness comes from the same place as keeping commitments.
Okay.
And so, like, if I feel like because you mentioned it, but like hearing someone's story and having them open up to you and share with you is kind of an honor. Mm-hmm. But it kind of feels like I can't forsake this thing that I've been led into. Mm-hmm. And if I look away, it feels like I'm doing that. And so some of it is just to like, I gotta help people, right? That is the more altruistic part of, well, sometimes altruistic, sometimes I gotta be the helper, but I am fueled and really focused on, man, people need help, and the church, it doesn't have to be the way that it is. And so many people have been hurt by the church. And so I want to take some responsibility for that, because I know that I've hurt people, certainly, but take responsibility for the problem at large and kind of driven to make right what I've been shown is wrong. Mm. And it feels like I'm honoring people in doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you, Jon. I want to close by asking you a kind of goofy question.
Yeah.
As a fellow fan of podcasts, what are your weekly listens?
So I listen to so for like my pop culture sci-fi stuff, I listen to the Ringerverse every week to get like caught up on House of the Dragon, the Rings of Power. That is like one of my favorite podcasts. These are people that I feel like I know, and they have a whole staff. Shout out to the Midnight Boys. Pew pew. Anybody who listens to that one. I love it. I love that kind of thing. And so there's a fair amount of pop culture. I listen to A World of Difference, which is Lori Adams Brown and her husband Jason Adams Brown, and they've been recently sharing their church abuse story. And they also interview other people. That's not the whole thing. So I definitely listen to that. The Bodies Behind the Bus. That's Jonna Harris. I can't remember. And Jay, her co-host, kind of walk through people's stories, and they've been kind of going through a lot of Acts 29 stories of church hurt. So I listen to some of that. There's a podcast that my friend Rob started called I Freaking Love This Movie. That I love pop culture stuff, and so I listen to his podcast and sometimes appear on it too. But like it's a mix of like very serious, like people like really like getting in the feels and sharing their story, and just completely ridiculous pop culture and sports. For sports, I love college football, so the Shutdown Full Cast. The internet's only college football podcast, as they bill it.
Where else are their podcasts?
Yeah.
I love it.
And so it's a real mix of like goofiness and seriousness. I'm sure there's a podcast that I'm missing that I really love, and when we're done, I'm gonna be like, no, I can't believe I forgot that. But yeah, I try to listen to a lot of things. I listen to your podcast as well since we've gotten connected.
Well, thank you. No, gosh, I'm glad I asked this question. What a wonderful interviewer I am. No, I'm kidding.
You're fantastic. No, you really are good.
No, but watching your face light up as you talk about these things that you love, I feel like is reinforcing all the things you said about these, the realness of these communities of, even a podcast you listen to, you don't necessarily interact with, in different ways, but that you feel like these people. It's a continuous or constant presence in your life, and it's
Absolutely.
a place where you find this community that is meeting your particular, maybe even more niche kind of interests, and how that impacts you. So I think that's really wonderful. I'm going to shoot you some of my favorite weirdo comedy podcasts that I listen to.
Oh my gosh, I would love to hear those. For the longest time, I listened to Comedy Bang Bang.
Yes.
Yeah, I love that podcast. It just fell out of rotation somehow. I don't know how.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. Oh, nobody needs to hear this, but except everyone does. Aga Wodum has a character on there now called Entrepreneur. And her whole thing is that she's always coming up with inventions of things that have already been invented. So I feel like that's the character for you, where she's like, what if there was a place where sick people could go and stay and have all the care they needed? And they're like, that's a hospital. She's like, now what is this? So
that's a little close to home.
I know.
That's so good. I don't know that I've ever laughed as hard as when I think it's James Adomian does Huell Hauser.
Oh yeah.
Which he is such a niche, I remember him from Southern California because that's where I grew up on PBS. He would have these shows and he just nailed this impression, and it was so specific that I cried the first time I listened to that. So, oh, cool. I can't wait to hear your other podcasts though. I get more for the list. I have too many podcasts. I've probably subscribed to 100+ podcasts that are just sitting there that I'm like, I'll get to that someday. And then there's episodes that are in there. And so but I'm excited about it.
Well, thank you everyone for listening to this podcast, and make your way on over and subscribe to Better on the Inside. So you can add something of more value to your podcast listenings too. Jon, where can people find you online? Where do you want to be found online?
Yeah, look, I'm the only person that doesn't like Instagram, apparently. All of the social platforms are at Jon Pyle, JonPyle. Twitter is by far my most, that's where I'm at all the time. You'll find me tweeting about church abuse and why I think Chris Pratt is playing Mario in the newest Super Mario Brothers movie. I don't know how online you are, but I realized today, I don't think they're going to give him a mustache to start. And that just I literally just tweeted about that. I don't think he's going to have a mustache. The poster has him facing away, and I think they're going to take away his mustache.
Okay, so find Jon on Twitter so you can enter this most important piece of discourse and be right there at the start of it.
Yeah. You get really serious and really goofy. There's really not a lot of in between with me.
Y'all, you heard it here first. Mario's mustache. We'll have to see. Well, thank you, Jon. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And until next time, peace and blessings to you all.